When you think of the great armies of the First World War, who do you think of? The French, the Germans, the British, the Russians? Americans are usually not the first to spring into the mind of historians. However, 4.8 million men from the USA served in Europe. Today we'll be discussing General Pershing's American Expeditionary Force. This is the tale of the Doughboys. Prior to the First World War, the army consisted of the National Guard and the Regular Army, of which the structure was primarily created to combat smaller-scale colonial conflicts rather than continental wars. This primarily saw the US Army far below the capabilities of the majority of European armies by the late First World War. General Shafter, the leader of the Cuban expedition, wrote to General Corbin in August of 1900, saying, "We are getting used to war now, and we have the necessary appliances and means to do so." The conflict with Spain was the largest scale war that the United States had seen post-Civil War, and had sowed the seeds in the mind of many about the end of American isolationism. Of course, the last major war in which the US Army swelled in size to the capabilities comparable to that of European armies was the American Civil War, in which 2.1 million men joined its ranks, and since that conflict, the US Army maintained a relatively small army, with each state having a National Guard similar in size to a British Corps. By 1916, however, the army was allowed to steadily grow after Woodrow Wilson's 1916 Defense Act, though a draft would not be introduced until the Selective Service Act of 1917. Prior to the combat of First World War, the town of Columbus, New Mexico, was attacked by the rebel known as Pancho Villa, which saw the deaths of 22 American civilians. This raid in March of 1916, repelled by the US 13th Cavalry Regiment, saw the entry of the US into the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. Under the command of then Brigadier General John J. Pershing, the aim of this campaign was to capture and arrest Pancho Villa. However, this ultimately failed, and US troops occupied the region until 1919 roughly, were involved until 1919. Perhaps the most notable of these conflicts was the Battle of Veracruz, in which US troops captured the port city after the unlawful detention of 9 American sailors by the dictator Mexican government. On April 6, 1917, then Major General John J. Pershing was appointed the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces following his outstanding performance in the Mexico expedition just a few months previously. He was an effective battlefield commander, a dependable tactician, and understood what needed to be done to bring the United States Army up to the standards of its allies. Pershing's essential goal for this force's doctrine was that of the Field Service Regulars' description of open warfare. However, these restrictions were largely ineffective for anything above brigade command and focused a lot on ration allocation rather than integrating aircraft, gas operations and tanks into a bigger combined force. Pershing, on the other hand, considered himself a master of modern fighting techniques, and saw the continent's arduous trench warfare as nothing more than a mindset. The army must be combative and capable of relying on self-reliant infantry. However, current military historians and allies of the time regard this ideology as incorrect, and Pershing's criticism of his allies' commanders' tactics with rifles and trenches accomplished little, but made him appear uninformed of the preceding 3 years of combat. Pershing and Chief of Staff General March disagreed on what the training should look like for this new force. It was eventually settled that March would control training stateside, while Pershing controlled training overseas. The approved open warfare doctrine did not provide solutions to the stark battlefield realities. AEF commanders adopted a new approach close to the French method of combat, or blindly followed the open warfare doctrine. To adopt French tactics was considered defeatist by the General Staff of the AEF, and Pershing deeply drilled into his troops on the continent that every soldier and officer of the United States must be completely abiding by the open warfare doctrine, and unquestionably overcome any challenges at bayonet's point. Described by Major Nichols of the US Command and General Staff College, our American leaders at the time chose to ignore reality and stuck with the old American doctrine in ignorance of modern warfare. Now, the formation of the AEF was comparable to that of the British Empire at the commencement of the war. As one British trainer said upon witnessing the American squads for the first time, "My God, this is Kitchener's army all over again." Major General Leonard Wood would explain the rush to build a viable army as the result of lack of preparation in the command hierarchy, and failure to adapt a 19th century force to a modern industrial army before entering the war had long-term consequences for the AEF's performance. The people needed to think that the drafty army was going to be as effective as a volunteer. Furthermore, tension growing within the ranks between the National, Regular and National Guard saw consistent friction between commanders, soldiers, and as General March remarked, there had been growing feeling of irritation and friction between different elements comprising the army. In response, Pershing issued General Order 73 in August of 1918, which saw all three combined into one full army to avoid clashes and breakdown of command. Despite being one army, however, there were still discernible differences. One physical sign of this exchange were orders that the required National Army and National Guard soldiers to change their NA or NG collar insignia with a US. Furthermore, issues of officer removal for the slightest infraction led to many living in a culture of fear, and many were relocated to instructor positions within schools. As Major General Edward Lewis of the 7th Division said, the action of superior authorities in taking away large numbers of officers of all grades and enlisted men to attend schools and receive instruction absolutely destroyed all results in the way of instruction on the companies and battalions. The result of this was that many officers and NCOs were instructed by instructors who had not once seen combat within their entire military career. The US AEF saw combat in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, 100 Days Offensive, the German Spring Offensive, Operation Michael, and the eventual occupation of the German territories after the armistice. Now, during the later half of this war, however, the American public and the government favoured the Kerensky government because there was a little thing known as the Russian Civil War at the time. Well, not the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution. And the Americans obviously supported the whites, and Wilson ordered 5,000 troops to take part in the campaign to assist the white government. This became known as the American North Russian Expeditionary Force. These forces saw combat in Ust-Pagenda, Shenkursk and Vyastavka, and ultimately withdrew within 1919. The AEF, if they'd been more keen to adopt newer measures for combat and improve the already outdated doctrine, the AEF could have performed miles better than it did. The leadership, namely Pershing, did no favours for the field command, and his adherence to force tactics which had already been proven ineffective lent him a reputation of being an amateur commander. To his allies, anyway. The US government contributed to the AEF's poor performance by delaying the draft, inadequately equipping the RA in pre-war years, and delegating National Guard training and equipment to state governments. The post-war impression of the AEF's performance is that it did exceptionally well. In actuality, it did modestly okay. It won battles, it lost, and post-war Pershing was celebrated as a massive war hero. He was promoted to General of the Armies, and this reputation really overshadowed the horrendous things that had happened, the casualties, it overshadowed the failures, and so much of this wasn't really discussed until after the Second World War, or at least during the Second World War. The structure of the American Expeditionary Force was relatively simple. It was split into several armies, under which of them were corps, divisions, brigades, unassigned brigades, and there were assistance by air wings and supported units. The First Army was officially established and activated by General John J. Pershing on July 4th, 1918, but it was legally formed when the US had entered the war in 1917. It participated in the Saint-Mihiel Offensive, Lorraine Offensive, Champagne Offensive, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It was finally demobilised and returned to the United States on April 30th, 1919. Under it was the 1st Corps under Major General Hunter Liggett, the 4th Corps under Major General George Wendell Reed, the 5th Corps under Major General William Wright, and the French 2nd Colonial Corps under Lieutenant General Ernest Joseph Blondlat. Now, within the Second Army, it was first created, or at least organised, by Colonel Stuart Heintzelman. Organised on the September 9th, and on October 12, 1918, General Robert Lee Bullard had taken command of the army, making Heintzelman his Chief of Staff. On October 26th, the formation committed to the Lorraine Offensive. It launched attacks in Lorraine and Saint-Mihiel and eventually liberated the Duchy of Luxembourg, and it was demobilised on April 15th, 1919, once the war was over. Within it was the 4th Corps under Major General George Wendell Reed, the 6th Corps under Major General Charles C. Ballou, the 7th Corps under Major General Omar Bundy, French 2nd Colonial Corps under Major General Henri Edouard Claudel, and the 17th French Corps under Lieutenant General Frédéric Émile Amédée Helot. The Third Army, following Germany's defeat, Allied soldiers occupied the Rhineland according to the provisions of the armistice. The United States sent over 240,000 men in 9 veteran divisions for this mission, accounting for nearly 1/3 of the total occupying force. These forces occupied under the Third Army, which Pershing established particularly for the task and was commanded by Major General Joseph Dickman. It was under the 3rd Corps Major General William Wright and the 6th Corps under Major General Charles C. Ballou. Now, within the army, you also had the list of commanders and senior staff, which formed a hierarchy in the following order. So you had the commander of the AEF, which was General John Pershing, between May 26, 1917 and August 31st, 1920. You had the Chief of Staff under Brigadier General James Harbour, May 26, 1917 to May 6, 1918, and there were others. There's the Deputy Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Leroy Eltinge, under May the 1st, 1918 to June 30th, 1919. There were others as well. You had the Assistant Chief of Staff, G1 for Administration, under Colonel James A. Logan Jr. Between July 5th, 1917 and August 19th, 1918. You had the Assistant Chief of Staff, or the G2 for Intelligence, the Assistant Chief of Staff for G3 for Operations, the Assistant Chief of Staff for G4 for Supply, the Assistant Chief of Staff for G5 Training. You had the Secretary of the General Staff, the Adjutant General. You had the Judge Advocate, Inspector General, Chief Quartermaster, Chief Surgeon, Chief Ordnance Officer, Chief Engineer Officer, Chief Signal Officer, Chief of Air Service, Provost Marshal General, General Purchasing Agent, Chief of Chemical Warfare, Director Generals of Transportation and Director General of Motor Transportation, Chief of Tank Corps, and the Chief of Artillery. The AEF had suffered around 320,000 casualties, including 53,402 battle deaths, 63,114 non-combat deaths, and 204,000 wounded. Only a few men were actually injured by poison gas, but many more believed they had been exposed during the war. During the later 1918 influenza epidemic in the US and France, almost 250,000 AFE soldiers died, and 360,000 became extremely ill. The highest rank one could attain within the army as of 1920 was the General of the Armies. This was a 6-star rank which only 3 officers in its history have been promoted to, including George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and John J. Pershing. First promotion occurred in 1919 when Pershing was promoted by Congress for his commanding of the AEF. The 1919 law that promoted Pershing gave the General of the Armies the same annual pay of $13,500, equivalent to $237,000 in 2023. That was set in 1870 for General William T. Sherman, plus $8,000 equivalent to $140,591 in 2023 in allowances. The rank would also allow retirement with full pay and allowances plus customization of dress uniform. However, the insignia remained 4 silver stars as worn by Pershing once he had become a full general. The rank of general saw only 3 promotions to 4-star general occur during the war. These were Bliss, Pershing and March during 1917 through 1918. This rank held full command of a AAF, usually a field army, or most senior positions within the War Department or the United States Army. The insignia held 4 stars. 3 lieutenant generals were created during the war, including Hunter Liggett and Robert L. Bullard. These ranks would have held corps command or senior staff positions within the force and held 3-star insignia. The Major General was the de facto highest rank anyone had held since the 1880s due to lack of necessity. Pershing held this rank until late 1917, and during his Mexico campaign, the rank would usually have command over either corps or division, and its insignia held 2 stars. The Brigadier General was the lowest rank within the United States General Officer grade prior and, well, during the war. As titled, the rank would have held command over a division or a brigade depending on the service, or probably hold a position on the staff, as we have seen. Now, the insignia held 1 star. The colonel was the most senior staff officer rank and held command over a regiment, a staff position, or perhaps another placement. The insignia held an American heraldic eagle. The lieutenant colonel was the secondary commander of a regiment or leader of a battalion during the war in Europe, and prior to, this rank held the insignia of a silver oak leaf. The major was a battalion or even a regimental XO or a second officer and was the lowest grade of staff officers. This rank held the insignia of a bronze oak leaf. The captain was a primary commander of a company or squadron within a battalion. The rank held the insignia of a double silver bar. The first lieutenant was the most senior of the platoon commanders, with approximately 30 men in each platoon. This rank held the insignia of a singular silver bar. The second lieutenant was the lowest grade of officers, which held something similar to that of a secondary platoon commander, and this rank was established more as a trainee officer role, held by those who had just graduated officership training in West Point or another military academy. And the rank insignia did not exist until 1917, in which a bronze escolta's bar was added.
Coming, the drums coming everywhere, so prepare, say a prayer.
Article 3, paragraph 9 of the Regulations for the Army of the United States, corrected April 15, 1917, gives the order of precedence for non-commissioned officers as the following. The highest was the sergeant major at regimental level. Other ranks or other names for the rank could be Sergeant Major Senior Grade in the Coast Artillery Corps. Then there was the Quartermaster Sergeant Senior Grade in the Quartermaster Corps. Similar ranks to that would be the Master Hospital Sergeant in the Medical Department or Master Engineer Senior Grade in the Corps of Engineers. Under that would be the Hospital Sergeant in the Medical Department or Master Engineer Junior Grade in the Corps of Engineers or Engineer in the Coastal Artillery Corps. Below that was the rank of Ordnance Sergeant, or also known to other branches as the Quartermaster Sergeant or the Supply Sergeant Regimental. Then you have the Sergeant Major lower class in the sort of squadron and battalion level, could be considered a Sergeant Major Junior Grade or Supply Sergeant Battalion Grade. Then there was the First Sergeant, and then below that was the Sergeant First Class. The Medical Department could be known as Sergeant First Class in the Quartermaster Corps, Corps of Engineers, or the Signal Corps as well. Then there was the Colour Sergeant, which is a senior sergeant. It has levels above squad command where it's assisting officers in duties or with specialist tasks. You have the Sergeant, which might be called a Mess Sergeant, who controlled the mess halls and food supply, and then you would Supply Sergeant Company, who would deal with things like ammunition, rations, those kind of things. And below that you had the Corporal, which was a senior soldier, probably had team command. Fire teams don't exist, but there were sort of smaller units of that type during the period. And then below that you have Private and Private First Class. Private First Class does have an insignia at this time, which is usually a small round button on the collar with a crossed rifle for infantry, or another insignia for depending on which branch of service you were in. And then lastly it is Private, which held no insignia, no proper standing in the army apart from being the lowest soldier, equivalent to that obviously of a volunteer. I hope you enjoyed today's video as much as I enjoyed making it. I found this really interesting. I hadn't really looked into American First World War history until pretty much recently. I found a paper by Major Nichols, is who I cited in this. You'll see him in the description along with other sources. But I read that. It was really interesting. I hadn't quite understood the level of which the US had involvement within the war. But if you like more videos like this, I have a few other episodes on the USA. I'm planning interwar period mainly, but I think I want to cover more United States history. I find it fascinating. Hopefully you do. But I will see you in the next video.